In 1852, Commodore Matthew Perry was assigned a mission by American President Millard Fillmore to force the Japanese to open their ports to American trade. Well, why did the United States wanted to enter Japan? To colonize or to make money? Well, actually, the growing commerce between the United States and China and the increasing control of coal mining stations by European powers in Asia were all contributing factors that made the United States to go for a naval invasion of Japan. And also, the shipwrecked American sailors were either imprisoned or executed by Japan. And the safe return of such persons was also one such demand. The Americans were also driven by a concept of manifest destiny and the desire to impose the benefits of Western civilization and also the Christian religion on what they perceived as backward Asian nations. And the Japanese were previously cautioned by the Dutch traders of Commodore Matthew Perry's naval voyage. But even upon being warned, the Japanese were unwilling to change their 250-year-old policy of national seclusion called sakuku. However, there was considerable internal debate in Japan on how best to meet this potential threat to Japanese economic and political sovereignty. During the US naval invasion, Japan was under shogun rule. It was a military rule. Military head was called shogun. It was basically called shogunate, which was a feudal system with military dictatorship, with hundreds of feudal lords ruling in their respective domain, with each domain or feudal lord having their own small army of samurai warriors. But eventually, the Western powers, Europe and the United States, had forced Japan to sign treaties that limited its control over its own foreign trade. This defeat at the hands of way too superior enemies left the feudal Japanese elites to think of a better political and military structure. And in 1868, when the Tokugawa shogun, also known as the Great General, this guy in the middle, he ruled Japan in the feudal period. And eventually, he lost his power and the emperor was restored to the supreme position. The Emperor Mutoshito took the name Meiji as his reign name. This event was known as the Meiji Restoration. And Meiji Restoration, at least nominally, returned control of the country to direct imperial rule under a 15-year-old Emperor Mutoshito, the Emperor Meiji. In a wider context, however, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 came to be identified with subsequent era of major political, economic and social change. Meiji Restoration in Japanese history was the political revolution in 1868 that brought about the final demise of the Tokugawa shogun, the military government, thus ending the Edo period between 1600 to 1867. These 250 years of rule under the military made Japan seclude itself from the world. Before the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan was under shogun or military rule, which was a feudal system with military dictatorship, as I have already told you. Then why I'm telling you again? Let it be. The leaders of the Meiji Restoration were mostly young samurai from feudal domains, who were historically hostile to Tokugawa authority. होता है ना कि कुछ powerful लोग होते हैं, then there are people who challenge the authority of more powerful person. Before the 15-year-old teenage Emperor Meiji was restored as head of Japan in 1868, the nation was a militarily weak country. It was primarily agricultural and had little technological development. It was controlled by hundreds of semi-independent feudal lords called shoguns, who had close to 1 million sword-wielding and fierce samurai to defend Japan, much like our Khalsas or Marathas or Rajputs. Although samurai were fierce warriors, but they could not stand against the modern machine guns and cannons. And the Japanese realized their deficiency when US Navy under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry attacked Japan in 1854. After the Meiji Restoration, the emperor became merely the rubber stamp, much like our President of India. And he had his group of advisors, a group of ambitious and patriotic men who were from the lower rank of samurai. This group of advisors, after receiving consent of the Emperor Meiji, quickly abolished the feudal system that prevailed in the country previously. And the cabinet system and the bureaucratic organization, much like Europe, came in its place. It was done in order to create a political structure much like that of Europe. The armies of each feudal domain were disbanded, and the National Army of Japan was created in 1872. The samurai and the feudal lords were initially remunerated on a yearly basis, and later on this was stopped when the government decided and declared all classes to be equal. Well, Japan had a distinct caste structure as well, with warrior samurai at the top. Japan under Meiji rule also regained complete control of its foreign trade and achieved full independence and equality in international affairs. Japan was rapidly transforming, and by the end of Meiji era, which was around 1912 when the Emperor Meiji died, Japan had highly centralized government, an elected parliament called the Diet, a well-developed transport and communication system, and an expeditiously growing capitalist industrial sector, with evolving state-of-the-art technology as well, with many large conglomerates called Zubitsu, like Mitsubishi, Nissan, Kawasaki. The adoption of the slogan enriched the country and strengthened the army. Fokuku Koi shows that the Japanese resolve to create a nation-state capable of standing equal among Western powers. The administrative reorganization in New Japan under Meiji rule had been largely accomplished by 1871, when the domains were officially abolished and replaced by a prefecture system of administration that has remained in place to present day. All feudal class privileges were abolished as well. Also, in 1871, a national army was formed, which was further strengthened 2 years later by a universal conscription law, which mandated the enrollment of every Japanese youth in army. It is still practiced in Israel, South Korea, and many other nations, Sweden, Norway. However, those revolutionary changes carried out by the Restoration leaders who acted in the name of Emperor Meiji faced increasing opposition by the mid-1870s. Disgruntled samurai participated in several rebellions against the government. The most famous rebellion was being led by the former Restoration hero Saigo Takamori of Satsuma. Watch The Last Samurai, starring my favorite Tom Cruise. Those uprisings were repressed only with great difficulty by the newly formed army, which was trained by the Americans. Peasants who were distrustful of the new regime and dissatisfied with its agrarian policies and too much of industrialization also took part in revolt that reached their peak in 1880s. Similar dissatisfaction is brewing in India among Indian farmers regarding new farm laws. The wholesale westernization of Japanese society was somewhat checked in the 1880s, when a renewed appreciation of traditional Japanese values emerged. Such was the case in the development of modern education system. That was highly influenced by Western theory and practice, but it was also stressing upon the traditional values of samurai loyalty and social harmony. That education system was hailed as the blend of East and West. And by the early 20th century, the goals of Meiji Restoration had been largely accomplished. Japan was well on its way to become a modern industrialized country. Decade after decade, the country was industrialized. People were moved from agriculture to industries. The unequal treaties that had granted foreign powers with judicial and economic privileges were later revised in 1894. And with the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 and its victory in two wars, one with China in 1894 and another 10 years later in Russia in 1904, Japan gained respect in the eyes of the Western world. Japan defeated China, much larger than its own size, and Russia, way bigger than Japan. And Japan started to appear for the first time on international scene as major world power. The death of Emperor Meiji in 1912 marked the end of the period. But the credit to lay the foundation of a new, powerful, semi-westernized, technological, capitalist, and Asian superpower, Japan, goes to a reluctant 15-year-old teenage Emperor Meiji under the guidance of abled minister during Meiji Restoration. In my next video, we're going to take the journey of Japanese economic miracle further to conclusion. We're going to discuss what led the Nobel laureate economist Simon Kuznets classify the world in 4 categories: the developed, the underdeveloped, Argentina, and Japan. We're going to discuss how Japan always leaves the world in awe with its economy. Till then, take a good care of yourself.